This time, a Republican, Trent Franks, said he will also resign. With rumblings that more allegations could surface, the big question is, who's next? Well, I have a great team here to break it all down. And I want to take you first to Garrett Haake on Capitol Hill. Garrett, we saw Al Franken's resignation coming. I mean, we just heard on Morning Joe, well, he resigned voluntarily. Not exactly. He was under a huge amount of pressure. What Al Franken had done was said, let the ethics committee investigate, and it sort of became a runaway train. But Trent Franks, that bubbled up quickly. What happened?
This bubbled up very quickly, Stephanie, and it's a much different type of story than what happened with Al Franken. What we know about the Trent Franks case is that a couple of his former staffers went to the speaker in the middle of last week and said they had these allegations they wanted to make about harassment and retaliation against him. From Frank's statement last night, he tells us that this stems from his family's struggles with infertility and the fact that he and his wife had been struggling to have children. They were trying to have younger siblings for their twins, and that he says he spoke to some staffers about surrogacy in a way that he now recognizes made them uncomfortable. In the intervening time between the middle of last week when this came to the speaker's attention and when we found out about it last night, the speaker had urged him to resign over this, said an ethics investigation would be coming. Indeed, the ethics committee announced last night they would investigate the sexual harassment part of this, potentially those conversations about the surrogacy that Franks discusses in his statement, but also possible retaliation, which is not something that's discussed in the statement and is probably the other half of this, why Franks felt he had to resign, according to his statement, effective at the end of next month.
Well, the thing that we need to point out, though, it was retaliation. So it wasn't just that he asked these women to potentially be interested in surrogacy. It's similar to, you could ask Charlie Rose. Charlie Rose has said on tape, you know, everything I had, you know, or I don't know if he said it on tape, but Charlie Rose could say my situations were consensual. But then you hear there's retaliation. We heard that when it came to Glenn Thrush. So in this case, this was about retaliation as much as it was him asking these women would they consider surrogacy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and that's sort of the unexplored part of this, having sort of broken late last night. Franks essentially admits in his resignation statement to these comments about surrogacy that could be viewed as making these women uncomfortable, that could be viewed as harassment, but there's nothing in the statement about the retaliation part of this, and I think that's sort of, as we probe this a little bit more, as we report it out a little bit further, I think that's what we're going to find out, maybe the reason why the Speaker's office felt and why Franks felt he had no choice but to resign.
All right, more interesting to me, the 84 grand. We previously heard that Republican Congressman Blake Farenthold used taxpayer money, 84 grand, to settle some sexual harassment claims from a staffer. But last night, one of his colleagues, Mia Love, said this.
This is something that, to me, shouldn't have been in place at all. We're using taxpayer dollars to settle these cases. So should Farenthold resign? I think that he should voluntarily resign because I believe we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard.
How significant is that? Whether Farenthold followed protocol and used monies that you're allowed to, at the end of the day, you see Trent resign or you see Al Franken resign due to pressure. Are we going to see that same kind of pressure hit Farenthold here?
So that's really the million-dollar question here, Stephanie.
No, it's the $84,000 question.
Sure. As you pointed out with Al Franken earlier, he resigned because of pressure from his colleagues. So if Mia Love there is the tip of the iceberg, if you see more Republicans, particularly more Republican women, come out and say that Farenthold should resign over this, that might build pressure. But remember, right now, Farenthold still has the support of leadership. The Speaker has said he shouldn't resign. Other Republican leaders in the House have said he should not resign, that he's sort of gone through the process. We're going to find out here if the pressure and the desire to have a sort of zero-tolerance environment among Republicans, as it has been this week among Democrats, is enough that it might push Farenthold to resign at some point. But again, you know, this will have to bubble up among his colleagues because right now, from the top, he has some cover.
All right, I need to bring my panel in. It's a good one. Jason Johnson, politics editor at TheRoot.com and professor at Morgan State University, and Elise Jordan, a Time columnist and former advisor to Senator Rand Paul, both MSNBC political analysts. Elise, I want to start with you because longtime journalist Neil King tweeted this, that he is hearing the total number of congressional members who may ultimately be linked to sexual harassment allegations could hit 40. 40. As a former Senate staffer yourself, listen, when I read these stories and I see so many of them are different, I think of my own career. I think of the 14 years I spent on Wall Street, not that it's good, bad, or otherwise, and I think if we are running people out of town for a grab and a tickle and a this, and yes, they're a huge problem, holy cow, there's a lot more coming.
Well, and the problem is how it's been policed for so many years. That is why the moment of reckoning is coming in such strong force on the Hill, because people want to say, well, why did $84,000 of taxpayer dollars, why was that paid to a former staffer of Blake Farenthold? What is the accountability standard here? And I really admire and respect Mia Love for coming out and saying that that is not fiscal conservatism for U.S. taxpayers to be paying settlements for Blake Farenthold, and that he should voluntarily resign.
All right, Jason, we know that Trent Franks said in a statement that he was resigning in part because of, quote, in the midst of this current cultural and media climate, I'm deeply convinced I would be unable to complete a fair House ethics investigation. Now, does he have a point here? Al Franken said, let's have an ethics investigation. That didn't happen. Public pressure is so big. Look at Joe Barton, for example. Joe Barton, whether it was revenge porn or not, Joe Barton had naughty, nudie pictures of himself spread throughout the internet and said, I'm not going to run again.
Right.
Can these guys, or women in some cases, are they getting a fair shake? Because...
So there's two ways to judge this, Stephanie, and I think this is important. There's the voters holding you accountable, and there's your colleagues holding you accountable. I am generally a fan, whether we're talking about Roy Moore or anybody else, of letting the voters eventually decide, is this tolerable behavior? But you're also part of a team. You're part of a club. You've got your letter jacket, right? And if your colleagues say, hey, I don't want someone like you working with me, I think that should matter as well. I do think it matters that Democrats and Republicans can say, hey, I don't want someone with this kind of behavior to be a part of a team. I wish they went back and did something about Gianfort, who attacks journalists. I wish they would go back and do this with several other people. But the idea of these men whining, saying, oh my gosh, I can't get a fair shake. Well, what about all the women that you were harassing? I can't imagine it's that hard to go through an entire state and find someone who hasn't grabbed someone's butt. I'm pretty sure you can find someone who hasn't done it.
Then is retaliation the issue? Elise, you're a girl from Mississippi. One could say there's been a lot of good old boys who have behaved in a slightly different way. Not that I appreciate it, not that I accept it. You may have worked in an office where they said, we like the lovely young ladies of this office to only wear dresses. I remember that when I interviewed to be an intern on the Hill, when I heard that, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. We don't roll that way in Jersey. But is there an argument to be made? The real issue here is retaliation. If you ask your employee to do something and they say no and you punish them for it, that's the issue.
If you ask your employee to carry a child for 10 months and then... as part of your job responsibilities.
It's 10 months.
It is 10 months. I think it's a sham when people say 9 months. It's a total sham.
It is a sham. And by the way, that 10th month, it's the worst one. Continue. Yes.
Can you imagine you're a young employee trying to do whatever your boss asks, trying to rise in the ladder, and one day he just drops that, yeah, bearing a child for me would be great too. Just, that's another, carry that child for the next 2
Those hips look like they could be good for me. I want to share what David Axelrod said. Obviously, Democratic strategist. He tweeted this. Ready? A strange principle is emerging. If you admit misconduct, you resign. But if you deny it, however compelling or voluminous the testimony against you, you continue in office or onto office. Well, that is the argument he's making is what we heard from Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
Right.
But Sarah Huckabee Sanders was asked about Al Franken. She said, well, he admitted doing it. The president didn't. This is the opposite of what we teach our children. I say to my kids, I don't care what you did, you got to tell me the truth, and I swear the punishment will be less. Are we living in the reverse world?
Well, we're living in the reverse world with Trump. I mean, look, he's at this point, he's using the Shaggy defense for, like, the Access Hollywood tape. It wasn't me. It wasn't my voice, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, I think there needs to be a standard that people actually hold themselves to. And it doesn't matter if you're a Republican. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat. Look, I think more Democrats and Republicans should say we don't want someone who admits to sexual assault being president of the United States. But unfortunately, his party will not enforce that on him. They're not going to push for impeachment. They're not going to push to hold him responsible. So I guess the voters are going to have to hold him responsible. That's how this is supposed to work. But at the end of the day, if people are arguing about this in terms of winners and losers, well, we'll lose this. That's not how this is supposed to work. It's supposed to be about right and wrong, basic common sense.
But I would also argue that the cultural moment has shifted. That right after President Trump was elected, that the women who had accused Trump of sexual harassment and misconduct, they completely were shut out basically in the media. The coverage stopped. They stopped pursuing their cases. President Trump had said that he was going to sue them.
But didn't.
And then the Harvey Weinstein moment happens.
Yeah.
And
isn't
more
that
women are
what's
coming
stunning?
out. And then, so
we were so, I remember after Access Hollywood, looking at Elise, saying to female colleagues, oh my gosh, the floodgates are going to open. Everything that we're pushing for is going to go backwards.
Right.
But now the reverse is, unless it relates to the president, the reverse has happened. Harvey Weinstein, Charlie Rose, Mark, I mean, it's one after the other.
And that's ultimately a good thing. I think the issue here also, when you're talking about retaliation, sometimes it's just the environment, right? Because it's the fear of retaliation. You look at John Conyers, he had people babysitting his kids, picking up his laundry, was telling them they had to meet him in hotel rooms. Sometimes someone doesn't have to retaliate against you. If you feel that someone can ask you a question that creepy, you know what's coming next if you say no. And so I want to see the enforcement of the actual rules on the books, because then people won't even be inclined to make those kinds of
We
requests.
need to change the workaround. Before we move on, I have to share this, because if you didn't read it yet, you must. David Brooks has a superb piece out where he's talking about the GOP rotting from the inside. And he says, there is no longer any middle ground for Republicans, that by not coming out against people like Roy Moore or Donald Trump, they are sacrificing the principles of their party. I have to ask you this, Elise, because you work for Rand Paul, and I've watched Rand Paul this week skirt, hide, and run from reporters who want to ask him about Roy Moore.
I have not been keeping up with what he's been saying on Roy Moore, and I disagreed with him.
That's why I'm here to help you
I
do that.
disagreed. Yeah, I disagreed with his initial endorsement way before these allegations were public. Just because I do not think that Roy Moore is in any way, shape, or form someone a civil libertarian should be endorsing. I think that this is putting a lot of people on Capitol Hill in a tough place. Are they going to entrench into their tribalism, or are they going to stand up for the principles that they really do hold dear? That's the
or
question.
tribalism. What does your tribe represent? I want to go back to Garrett Haake, because there's other big news. Congress averted a government shutdown yesterday. Come on, Garrett. We knew they were going to. It was a whole big show for a whole lot of nothing.
Well, I think that's mostly right. Nobody wanted a shutdown, at least not right now, but we might be having a different conversation 2 weeks from now. Republicans want to make sure that absolutely nothing gets in the way of finishing their tax reform push. And so shutting down the government or having a fight over government spending right now is not helpful. They're going to kick that down the road 2 weeks. Similarly, Democrats have to figure out how hard they want to fight about a DACA fix before the end of the year. If they're going to really fight to get the DREAM Act passed or to get something passed to address those dreamers before the end of December, as they have said they would. And then finally, there's the actual issue of spending. How much are we going to spend on the military, and how much are we going to spend on everything else in the domestic sort of programs bucket? All of these things have to be resolved. And yesterday, we saw the leadership of both parties agreeing to kick that can down the road for at least 2 more weeks.
All right, now to some other breaking news, awful news out of Southern California, where the devastating wildfires have come up out of the mountains and canyons and are now chewing through neighborhood after neighborhood. At least 500 buildings have been burned, and nearly 200,000 people have been chased from their homes across a huge part of the state. From